Ilara felt the world had ended twice. First, with the low, final rattle in Liam's chest, a sound that had stolen all the air from their small, rented room in the town. The second ending was the slow, grinding one that followed, as the meager contents of their life were sold off to cover debts she never knew he had accrued. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a deed to a piece of land that was considered a local joke. 10 acres of rock and scrub pine. So unwanted it had been the only thing the creditors had not bothered to claim. Its sole distinguishing feature was a calamity, the corpse of a colossal white pine, a monarch of the forest that had been felled by a lightning strike a decade prior. It lay like the spine of a dead god across the most promising patch of soil, its gargantuan root ball ripped from the earth, leaving a raw, weeping crater. The land was a liability, a monument to failure. People in the town spoke of it in hushed, pitying tones when she passed. They remembered Liam's grand, foolish dream of building a life there, a dream that had died long before he did. Now it was hers, this patch of stubborn dirt on the far edge of the territory, where the wind came down from the northern peaks with a blade in its teeth. It was late autumn, and the sky was the color of old pewter, a hard, unforgiving lid on the world. The air smelled of pine rot and impending snow. Ilara stood at the edge of her inheritance, a woman hollowed out by grief and stripped bare by poverty, and felt the second ending press down upon her. She was 29 years old and possessed nothing but a parcel of land, defined by its greatest ruin. Her brother-in-law, Thomas, arrived a week later. He drove his wagon right to the edge of the property line, not deigning to step onto the land itself, as if its bad luck were contagious. He was a thick, prosperous man, his face ruddy with the confidence of someone whose barns were always full and whose wife never wanted for anything. He had Liam's eyes, but none of his gentleness. He looked at Ilara, her thin frame wrapped in a threadbare shawl, and then his gaze swept over the rocky terrain and the fallen giant, a flicker of something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt in his eyes. It was the look of a man assessing livestock that was not worth the price of its feed. He cleared his throat, a sound of officious sympathy. "Ilara, I've come to help you. This is no place for a woman alone." It wasn't a place for Liam, and he was twice your size. He gestured vaguely at the sprawl of useless land. "I'll take it off your hands. Give you $50 for the deed. Enough to get you a room in town for the winter. Find some respectable work. A kindness for my brother's memory." He said the word kindness, as if it were a heavy coin he was reluctantly parting with. Ilara's gaze followed his to the fallen tree. The trunk was wider than she was tall, a great wooden continent stretching for over 100 feet. Its bark was furrowed like an old man's face, and where the lightning had struck, a long, dark scar ran its length. It was magnificent in its death. $50, she thought. The price of being erased. The price of admitting that she, like the land, was worthless. She looked at the tree, then back at Thomas. His offer was not a kindness. It was a final burial. He wanted the land for the standing timber on the back 5 acres, scrubby though it was, and perhaps he thought he could eventually section and haul the fallen giant for firewood over a few years. It was a purely practical calculation, scrubbed clean of sentiment or memory. He was sweeping away the last remnant of his brother's life, and her with it. A cold resolve, thin and sharp as an icicle, formed in her chest. It was the first thing she had truly felt since Liam's passing, a feeling that was not grief or fear, but a quiet, unyielding refusal. "No," she said. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but it did not tremble. Thomas blinked, his composure momentarily fractured. "No? Ilara, be sensible. The first snow will be here in a month. You can't live here. There's no shelter, no well, nothing. You'll freeze." His concern was a performance, a tool to get what he wanted. He saw a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. "I'm not selling," she repeated, her eyes fixed on the great dead tree. He stared at her for a long moment, the ruddy color deepening in his cheeks. "Fine," he snapped, the facade of familial duty dropping away to reveal the hard stone of his impatience. "Starve then. Freeze. Don't come crying to me when you're begging for scraps at the church door." He climbed back onto his wagon, the wood groaning under his weight, and rode away without a backward glance. The dust he kicked up settled slowly in the cold, still air. Alara stood alone, the silence of the land rushing back in to fill the space his anger had occupied. The deal was refused. The final ending was postponed. Now she had to survive. For days she simply existed. She had a small canvas tent, a relic from a prospecting trip Liam had taken years ago, and a handful of supplies bought with the last of her money. She spent her time walking the 10 acres, learning their contours, the way the light fell, the places where the wind bit hardest. Her constant companion was the fallen pine. It was the anchor of the property, its sheer mass warping the landscape around it. The crater left by its roots was a deep, semicircular wound in the earth, a hollow protected from the wind on 3 sides by the towering, tangled mass of earth and roots. She found herself seeking shelter there when the wind grew too sharp. She would press her back against the cool, damp soil of the crater wall and watch the gray sky churn above. It was during one such moment, huddled deep in the earthen bowl, that the idea came. It was not a flash of lightning like the one that had felled the tree, but a slow, quiet dawn of understanding. She pressed her hand against the packed dirt of the crater wall. It was cold, but it was a still cold, a deep, cellular cold of the earth, not the sharp, aggressive cold of the wind. The air in the crater was calmer, several degrees warmer than the exposed land just a few feet away. Then she looked at the log. The trunk, lying on its side, was a wall of solid wood nearly 6 feet thick. An impenetrable barrier. But what if it wasn't a barrier? What if it was a vessel? She had heard old tales from her grandmother, stories from a time before sawmills and clapboard houses, of people who had wintered in hollow sycamores or dugout shelters on the plains. It was the talk of primitives, of a desperate bygone era. Conventional wisdom in this part of the country was to build high, to raise your house on stone pilings to get it away from the snow and the frozen ground. To burrow into the earth was to invite the damp, the frost, the grave. But the wind howled over the lip of the crater, and Alara, tucked inside its quiet pocket, felt the faintest whisper of a different kind of wisdom. The earth did not fight the cold. It held a deep, steady temperature, a quiet truce with the seasons. The tree was dead, but its body was still strong, a fortress of cellulose and lignin. The plan that formed was an absurdity. It was the logic of a mad woman or a cornered animal. She would not build a cabin. She would excavate one. She would make her home inside the dead giant, sinking it into the cradle of the earth it had torn open for itself. She would burrow. She would live not on the land, but in it, sheltered by the 2 things everyone else saw as its ruin, the hole and the deadfall. The sheer, monumental labor of it should have crushed the idea before it could draw breath. She had only an axe, a wood saw that had belonged to Liam, a shovel and a few smaller hand tools. But desperation is its own kind of fuel, and the memory of Thomas's sneering face was a whetstone for her resolve. She began the next morning. The first task was to choose the section of the trunk. She selected a 20-foot length about a third of the way down from the root ball, where the log lay flattest and was thickest. The bark was like armor plate. It took her the better part of 2 days, using the axe and a small pry bar, to peel away a section of bark big enough to serve as a doorway. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were soon a mass of blisters and raw skin. The muscles in her back and shoulders screamed with a pain she had never known. Each night she would collapse in her tent, too tired to eat, and fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep. only to wake before dawn, every inch of her body a dull, throbbing ache. Once the bark was gone, she faced the wood itself. It was ancient white pine, seasoned for a decade where it lay. It was as hard as iron. Her axe bounced off the surface with a dull thud, barely making a chip. She sharpened it on a river stone until she could shave a hair from her arm, but it made little difference. The scale of the task was crushing. She was a fly trying to chew its way through a mountain. For a full day she sat in defeated silence, the immensity of her folly washing over her. Thomas was right. The townspeople were right. She would freeze. But as she sat there, her gaze fell on the dark, charred scar left by the lightning. The wood there was blackened, brittle. She could break pieces of it off with her fingers. An idea, born of that observation, took hold. Fire. She couldn't cut her way in, but perhaps she could burn her way in. It was a dangerous, half-crazed notion. She was proposing to live inside this log. Setting it ablaze seemed a poor beginning. Yet she had no other options. She gathered dry tinder and built a small, controlled fire against the exposed heartwood where her door would be. She didn't let it rage. She kept it small, a persistent, hungry heat that licked at the wood. For hours she tended it, her face blackened with soot, her eyes stinging. When the fire had burned for half the day, she doused it with water hauled in buckets from a nearby creek. The surface of the wood was now a thick layer of charcoal. She took up her adze, a curved cutting tool used for shaping wood, and swung it. This time it did not bounce. It bit deep into the softened, carbonized wood, pulling away large, black chunks. A thrill, fierce and triumphant, shot through her. It was working. It was agonizingly slow, a process of inches, but it was working. Her life fell into a grueling rhythm. Burn, scrape, chop. Burn, scrape, chop. Each day she would carefully manage the fire, letting it eat away another few inches of the log's interior. Then she would spend hours in the growing hollow, the air thick with the smell of char and damp pine, scraping away the blackened wood with the adze and a wire brush. The inside of the log became her world. She learned its geography, the subtle curves of its grain, the hard knots that resisted the fire and had to be chiseled out by hand. She was not merely hollowing a log, she was performing a kind of reverse sculpture, carving space out of substance. The pile of charcoal and wood chips outside her growing doorway grew into a small black mountain. Her work did not go unnoticed. Silas, who ran the general store in town, made his weekly supply run to the scattered homesteads out her way. He stopped his wagon, his face a mask of bewildered concern. "Ilara," he said, his voice gentle, "what in God's name are you doing?" She was covered in soot, her hair matted, her face gaunt. She looked like a creature born of fire and earth. "I'm building my home, Silas," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. He looked at the blackened hole in the side of the colossal log, at the pile of charcoal, and shook his head slowly. "Child, this is madness. That's a grave you're digging, not a home. The winter will take you. There's still time. I can talk to the Reverend, we can find you a place." His words were kind, but they were the same words as Thomas's, just wrapped in a softer cloth. They saw a fragile widow losing her mind to grief. They did not see the meticulous, desperate engineering she was engaged in. She thanked him for his concern, but bought another sack of beans, a tin of lard, and a length of stovepipe, paying with the last of her coins. The purchase of the stovepipe seemed to seal her fate in his eyes. He gave her the goods with the sad resignation of a man watching someone walk willingly into a blizzard. News of her project spread through the town, carried by Silas's troubled report. The widow Ilara, they called her at first. Then it became the Pine Woman. And then, less kindly, the Mole. Children would dare each other to run to the edge of her property and shout names before fleeing in feigned terror. She was becoming a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale about what happens when a woman is left to her own devices. She ignored them. The world outside the log had ceased to matter. The only things that were real were the rasp of the saw, the bite of the adze, and the steady, slow retreat of the wood before her fire and her tools. After 3 weeks of relentless labor, she had carved out a space roughly 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. The walls of her cavern were a curved, soot-blackened shell of pine, inches thick. It was small, but it was solid. Now she turned her attention to the earth. She began to excavate the crater, deepening the semicircle in front of her log hollow. She used the shovel to dig down, creating a sunken entryway, and used the excavated earth and rock to build up low, thick walls on either side, extending them from the log. She was creating an earth berm, a sheltered courtyard that would be sunk below the frost line and protected from the wind. This work was different, a conversation with stone and soil. She lined the floor of the crater with flat stones from the creek bed, creating a crude but level floor. The work was a meditation. Her body, which had at first screamed in protest, had hardened. The blisters on her hands had become calluses. The ache in her back had settled into a dull, familiar companion. She felt stronger than she had ever been in her life, a strength forged not in a gym or a field, but in the solitary, focused act of creation. She was not just building a shelter. She was rebuilding herself. Thomas came back in mid-November. The first flurries of snow were in the air, melting as they touched the ground. He came not in a wagon, but on horseback, as if he expected to make a quick and final inspection of her failure. He found her not huddled in a freezing tent, but fitting a small, sturdy door made of salvaged planks into the opening of her log. She had fashioned a window on the opposite side, using a small pane of glass she'd found miraculously intact at an old dump site. A thin length of stovepipe poked up from the top of the log. A jaunty, defiant finger pointed at the gray sky. He stared, his mouth slightly agape. He saw the sunken, earth-walled entrance, the solid door, the neat pile of firewood stacked against the root ball. This was not the scene of pathetic desperation he had come to witness. It was something organized, intentional. "What is this foolishness?" he finally managed, his voice tight with a strange mixture of anger and confusion. "You've burrowed into the ground like an animal. This hole will be your tomb when the snows come. You've shamed my brother's name with this den." "I have a home," Alara replied calmly, not looking at him, her focus on setting a hinge. "It is warm, and it is mine. You will be begging for shelter before the new year," he sneered, "and I will remind you of this day." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, but this time his anger felt different. It was not the confident dismissal of before. It was the unease of a man whose certainties were being challenged by something he could not comprehend. She finished her work as the first true snow began to fall. She sealed the gaps around her door and window with a mixture of mud and moss. She built a small stone hearth inside, venting the stovepipe through the roof of the log, packing the opening with clay and rock to prevent the fire from spreading. Her last act was to drag the old canvas tent over the top of the log, creating an extra layer of windbreak and a surface that would hold the snow. Her home was complete. From the outside, it was a bizarre sight. A huge, snow-dusted log sunk into an earthen mound, with a single door and a wisp of smoke rising from its spine. It looked less like a house and more like a feature of the landscape, a hibernating creature waiting for spring. Inside, it was another world. The space was small, womb-like, and filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. The thick wooden walls, now scrubbed clean of the loose soot, glowed a warm, dark red in the light from her small stove. Her few possessions were arranged neatly. A bed of pine boughs covered with blankets. A small table. Her cooking pots hanging from wooden pegs. She lit the stove, and within an hour, a deep, penetrating warmth filled the space. The cold of the outside world was not simply blocked. It was nullified. The massive thermal mass of the log and the surrounding earth absorbed and held the heat, creating an environment of profound and steady comfort. She had done it. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. It began with a week of heavy, ceaseless snow that buried the world in a blanket of white 4 feet deep. Then the temperature dropped. It fell past 0, past 10 below, and kept falling. The wind came, a relentless, scouring force from the Arctic that drove the snow into drifts as high as houses and sucked the heat from every board and nail in the territory. It was a legendary winter, the kind old men would speak of for generations to come. They called it the Great Freeze. In the town, it was a catastrophe. Houses built on raised foundations, designed to stay above the snow, were now exposed to the full, brutal force of the wind. The cold infiltrated every crack. Water in barrels froze solid. Pipes burst. Livestock, caught in poorly insulated barns, froze to death where they stood. People huddled in their homes, feeding their stoves constantly. But it was a losing battle. The houses were bleeding heat faster than they could generate it, the wind pulling it away mercilessly. The forests were too deep in snow to reach for more wood. Families began burning furniture to stay alive. In her ground pine house, Ilara was warm. The snow that the townspeople cursed was her greatest ally. It piled deep over her log and against her earthen berms, becoming a perfect, weightless blanket of insulation. The wind that terrorized the valley screamed harmlessly over the top of her sunken dwelling. The earth beneath her, at a constant temperature of 40 degrees, radiated a gentle coolness that tempered the heat from the stove, preventing the small space from becoming stuffy. Her little stove, fed with a few logs a day, was all she needed. The temperature inside her home never dropped below 65 degrees. She had created a pocket of thermal equilibrium, a tiny, self-regulating ecosystem of warmth in the heart of the frozen world. She spent her days reading by the light of a tallow lamp, mending her clothes and listening to the muffled howl of the storm outside. She felt not a single shiver of the freeze. Thomas's farmhouse was one of the finest in the region, a sturdy, 2-story clapboard structure built with pride and expense. It was also a fortress under siege. The wind had peeled shingles from his roof. A fine dusting of snow covered his attic floor. Despite having 2 large hearths roaring day and night, the rooms were bone-chillingly cold. On the 4th day of the deep freeze, his well pump froze solid. On the 5th, a water pipe in the kitchen burst, encasing one wall in a glittering shroud of ice. He and his wife were confined to a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces tight with fear and exhaustion. They were running out of firewood. It was desperation that drove him out, a primal fear he had never known. He thought of Ilara. He pictured her frozen body in her foolish hole in the ground, and a pang of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, cut through his pride. It was his duty, as her last living relative, to at least make an attempt to see if she was gone. He told himself it was duty, but deep down it was a frantic need to see someone, anyone, who might be worse off than he was. He bundled himself in layers of wool and oilskin and stepped out into the teeth of the blizzard. The journey of 2 miles took him nearly 3 hours. The world was a churning chaos of white, the wind a physical blow that stole his breath. He navigated by memory, following the faint line of trees that marked the edge of her property. He nearly missed it. Her home was so completely buried in snow that it had become just another drift in the landscape. The only sign of life was the thin, almost invisible plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe, a detail he almost mistook for wind-blown snow. He stumbled down into the sunken entrance, the snow up to his waist, and hammered on the wooden door with a gloved fist, his knuckles numb. "Ilara!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the gale. "Ilara!" He did not expect an answer. He was preparing himself for the grim task of forcing the door and finding what lay within. The door opened. A wave of warm, pine-scented air washed over him, so shocking in its contrast to the brutal cold that it felt like a physical blow. Alara stood there, framed in the soft lamplight from within. She was wearing a simple wool dress. Her face was calm, her cheeks had a healthy color. She was not shivering. She was not even wearing a shawl. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Thomas stared, his mind unable to process the scene. The warmth, the quiet, the scent of cooking stew. He looked past her into the cozy, glowing space. It was impossible. It defied every law of nature and common sense he knew. His own grand house was a failing icebox. This hole in a log was a haven. The arrogance and anger were scoured out of him, replaced by a profound, soul-shaking bewilderment. He stood there, the wind tearing at his back, the warmth of her home a promise on his face, and he could only manage a single, hoarse word. How? She did not answer immediately. She simply stepped aside, holding the door open for him. It was all the invitation he needed. He stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with him, and she pushed the heavy door shut, sealing them inside the quiet warmth. The roar of the blizzard vanished, replaced by the gentle crackle of the fire. Thomas slowly unpeeled his frozen outer layers, his movements stiff, his eyes never leaving the curved wooden walls. He was a man who had just seen a fundamental truth of his world overturned. The deal was done, but it was not the one he had offered. He had come seeking confirmation of her failure and had found the humbling evidence of his own. When the great freeze finally broke, the world that emerged was scarred and changed. The thaw revealed the devastating toll the storm had taken. The community was humbled, brought low by a force of nature they thought they had tamed. The stories began to circulate almost immediately, whispered at first, then spoken with open wonder, the tale of how Thomas, the wealthiest farmer in the valley, had been forced to take shelter with his mad sister-in-law in her hole in the ground. It was Silas who came first, not with pity, but with a quiet, respectful curiosity. He brought a gift of fresh-baked bread and a jar of honey. "May I see it?" he asked, his hat in his hands. Alara led him inside. He ran his hand over the smooth, warm wood of the walls. He noted the cleverness of the ventilation, the efficiency of the small stove, the way the earth itself was part of the structure. He understood. He saw not a primitive burrow, but a masterpiece of pragmatic, environmental design. He saw the wisdom she had uncovered. "I'll be damned," he breathed, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You didn't build on the land, you partnered with it." He looked at her, his eyes full of a newfound respect. He was her first convert. The community's perception shifted like a river changing its course. The mockery and suspicion curdled into awe. They had shivered in their drafty, proper houses, while she had been snug in her log. Their conventional wisdom had failed them, while her madness had saved her. She was no longer the mole woman. She became simply Alara of the Pine. People began to seek her out, not with charity, but with questions. They brought her gifts of food and tools, not as handouts, but as payment for her knowledge. Other families who had lost their homes or who were too poor to build with expensive milled lumber asked if she would teach them. And she did. She showed them how to read the land, how to find the right kind of deadfall, how to use controlled fire and patience to hollow out a home. She taught them how to work with the earth, not against it, to use the insulating power of soil and snow as an ally against the cold. The ground pine house, as Silas had named it, became a symbol of resilience in the region. It was not a home for the rich or the proud, but for the practical and the humble, a shelter born of necessity and ingenuity. Her method became the new standard for those living on the margins, a piece of quiet knowledge passed down through generations. Decades passed. Ilara lived out her days in the home she had carved from the earth and a dead tree. She never remarried, finding a deep and abiding companionship in her solitude and her self-sufficiency. Her home became even more a part of the landscape. Moss grew thick on the log's back, and wildflowers bloomed on the earthen berms of her entryway. From a distance it looked like nothing more than a green and pleasant mound, a sleeping hillock dreaming in the sun. Children, grandchildren of the ones who had once mocked her, would visit, bringing her small gifts and listening to her stories, looking at her with a reverence usually reserved for founders and saints. The story of the woman who built a home inside a fallen pine became a foundational myth of the place, a reminder that the most profound wisdom is often quiet, hidden, and easily overlooked. It is a lesson whispered by the earth, not shouted from the rooftops. Her life stood as a testament to the idea that true value is not always visible on the surface, that what one person discards as a ruin, another, with a different way of seeing, can recognize as the cornerstone of a fortress. It is a story about the quiet courage it takes to look foolish in the eyes of the world, to trust an instinct that runs contrary to all accepted logic, and to find a way not merely to survive, but to flourish by burrowing deep into the heart of things.